A political revival for Viktor Yanukovych years after being ousted in what was called the Orange Revolution. Have the Ukrainian people turned their backs on the promise of that time, or is the spirit of democracy still triumphant? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. The man ousted from power just 5 years ago appears to have been voted back in. Viktor Yanukovych has claimed victory in Ukraine's presidential election. Official results put him around 3% ahead of his rival, the Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko. Yanukovych was elected president back in 2004, but following nationwide protests in what became known as the Orange Revolution, the result was annulled, and Yanukovych was defeated in the revote. He argues this result vindicates what was dismissed as a flawed election all those years ago.
I didn't have to do anything special for people to begin supporting me. It was the orange politicians that couldn't work effectively. They weren't reliable either for the East or the European Union. Their politics didn't help the economy to grow, and it didn't improve the quality of life.
Yulia Tymoshenko, the Prime Minister and one of the former leaders of the Orange Revolution, has said she will not concede defeat.
The results of the exit polls are pure sociology. To everyone who wants to understand the essence, this is just sociology. A split in results of 3% is within the margin of error.
The vote would appear to confirm that many became disillusioned in the wake of the Orange Revolution. Its leaders promised to end corruption and rid the country of the oligarchs. They also vowed to increase ties with the EU while cutting ties with Russia. But amidst ongoing economic crisis, poverty is still rife, and the power and influence of the oligarchs has actually increased. Membership of the EU isn't even on the horizon. And lately, the Ukraine's leaders have been talking about mending relations with Russia. Add to that public infighting between those who were allies in the revolution and the way cleared for the return of Viktor Yanukovych. Well, joining our discussion today are our guests. In Kiev, Sergei Taran, director of the International Democracy Institute in Kiev. In Moscow, Dmitry Babich, political analyst and columnist at Russia Profile magazine. And in Birmingham, Katerina Vuchuk from the Center for Russian and East European Studies at the University of Birmingham and an expert in Ukraine-EU relations. Well, let's begin in the center of events. Sergei Taran, international observers have approved the voting process. Is there any dissent among those in Kiev and beyond?
Well, it looks like we have now a clear result of the elections. Yanukovych won, but it's curiously that he won under conditions created by the Orange Revolution. So paradoxically, Yanukovych is a victor of these elections, but he now acts in the society created by the Orange Revolutions. So paradoxically, he became one of the winners of these Orange Revolutions, because as we can see now, we have transparent elections, we have a free society, we have freedom of speech, and that is exactly the values of the Orange Revolutions. So Yanukovych actually is a winner of the Orange Revolution, and at the same time he is one of the beneficiaries of this.
Dmitry Babich in Moscow, do you also see this as a paradox?
No, not at all, because actually if we see at the number of votes that Mr. Yanukovych got at this election, it's almost the same as the number that he got in the second round of elections in 2004, which the Western press declared to have been rigged and to be absolutely fraudulent. So, to my mind, the only losers in these elections are Western analysts who, in the years 2004 and 2005, called Yanukovych a stooge of the Kremlin, a non-entity, a person who will disappear from the political scene as soon as democracy is established. All of these people proved themselves to be wrong, and I think they should be ashamed now.
But have we not also had a difference in time, a change in circumstances since that so-called Orange Revolution?
Well, if we look at the number of votes, it stayed largely the same. Just a small fraction of orange voters didn't turn out for the second round because they were probably disillusioned with Mrs. Tymoshenko, which is not surprising after all the ugly battles she had with Mr. Yushchenko. And basically, Orange Revolution didn't bring anything. It brought deterioration of relations with Russia. It brought economic crisis, which the Orange authorities were unable to solve. And it brought a lot of unexpected and unrealized hopes from the West.
Well, let's
so
go
the West became disillusioned.
Well, let's go to Katerina Volchuk in Birmingham. We heard there that the Orange Revolution brought nothing. Some might argue that, in fact, it created the environment in which this presidential election has taken place. What's your view?
Yeah, I'll allow myself to disagree with the previous speaker. Definitely, the Orange Revolution created the situation for these presidential elections to be fair and transparent. And that's a very different situation from what we had in 2004. So although there is a massive disappointment in Ukraine, then many of the promises of the Orange Revolution have not been delivered. Sort of democratic foundations of Ukraine have been created, and Ukraine is one of the very few states in the former Soviet Union which actually can claim to be democratic. And paradoxically, Viktor Yanukovych has learned some lessons, and we haven't seen sort of the same. For example, the fact that international observers seem to imply that there were minor violations, but not really gross abuses of power as were recorded in 2004, suggests that sort of even the losers from the Orange Revolution were allowed to become the winners because of the Orange Revolution.
Well, let's speak to Dmitry Babich in Moscow again there. Are we looking, though, despite your feelings about what has not happened in intervening years, are we looking at a truly democratic process?
Well, I wouldn't say so, because rules have been changing lots of times between 2004 and now. Just days before this election, the parliament voted the Minister of Interior out because the parliament suspected him of interfering with the vote. And then immediately, Mrs. Tymoshenko made this dismissed minister a minister, in fact, again. The parliament was dissolved in 2007, something that had not happened before the Orange Revolution. So I see this Orange Revolution as a totally negative process. The main problem of Ukrainian authorities bridging the gap between East and West was not solved. In fact, this gap has become wider in the last 5 years because the East became angry with the West, saying that the East sold out to Russia, that it was not democratic, that it was somehow inferior to Western Ukraine and to the rest of Europe.
Well, let's go to Sergei
Orange authorities did not solve anything.
Yes, let's go to Sergei Taran in Moscow, and we'll pick up on that point subsequently. But the point that I want to make to you, Sergei Taran, is, do you view this process as democratic? Is this a maturing of Ukrainian democracy, would you say?
Oh, definitely. Now we have one more time the change from power to opposition and from opposition to power. And such peaceful transition is a basic indicator of the quality of the democracy, of any democracy, in particular Ukrainian. And also, I would like to add that, in fact, we have more and more cross-voting between different regions. And we can clearly see how people from different regions can get support from another region. So I would not agree with the statement that we have a gap between East and the West. If you look actually carefully on how the country votes, you would not find actually the East and the West. Because, in fact, many regions in East, like Sumskaya Oblast, vote for Tymoshenko, and many regions on the West, like Zakarpatskaya Oblast, vote for Yanukovych. Moreover, I would underline that people from different parties can migrate from one party to another. So, for example, we cannot even compare such situation, for example, with Middle East or with, let's say, Belgium, where one region means one region, and people from that region and from that party cannot go to another party.
Well, let's play this all in a context, Sergei. Let's take a look at the wider context. Yanukovych has twice served as prime minister after being driven from power in the Orange Revolution. His political career appeared to be over, but he seems to have made a remarkable comeback. Now, he gains much of his support from the Russian-speaking east and south of the countries. His policies were once conceived to be pro-Kremlin and anti-West, but now he says he's keen for Ukraine to integrate with Europe and at the same time insisting that the country should be kept out of NATO. Now, let's now go to Katerina Furchuk in Birmingham. We heard earlier Dmitry Babic saying that this gap, this struggle between relations with East and West has been intensified. What do you think is looming in this process now?
It is indeed the fact that Yanukovych will face some difficult foreign policy choices. Because of the institutional stalemate created by the Orange Revolution, the fact that the president has to share power with the prime minister, it meant that sort of different political forces pursued different foreign policy strategies. And now, for Yanukovych, is a challenge to unify and clarify the situation. And although he's perceived as anti-Russian, as anti-Western and pro-Russian, in fact, he represents business interests which are very interested in fostering closer ties with the European Union. However, he's perceived as a villain. In the European Union, the accusations of fraud during the presidential elections of 2004 means that he will have to work very hard to persuade the European leaders that he actually means that he really is interested in bringing Ukraine closer to Europe.
But we've also heard recently signs of strain with Russia, for example. Dmitry Babic, do you see the position of the man who would appear to be the next president as aligned to the interests of Russia or to the West or to neither?
Well, I think that Yanukovych will be pro-Ukrainian. He will not be pro-Russian, and he will be mildly pro-Western, as any sensible Ukrainian politician should be. I think the West is very much a victim of its own stereotypes. When Yanukovych was declared a Kremlin stooge in 2004, I think that was a terrible simplification, and it shows how incompetent the people are who are responsible for the European Union's and for the American policy towards Ukraine. I don't know how Yanukovych can prove himself to be an honest man. He won a parliamentary election, he won presidential election, which the West recognized. So how can the West keep saying that he is a fraudulent politician? If he had indeed rigged the election in 2004, people would not vote for him now.
Well, Sergei Taran in Kiev, lots of points being made there. Importantly, though, is that question of is the man who's likely to become the next president going to be aligned with one or other party? Or, as we heard there from Moscow, is he going to put the interests of Ukraine before all else?
Well, I actually agree with this, and I would not find Yanukovych pro-Russian or pro-Western. Actually, in this election, unlike in previous elections, Kremlin did not support any of these candidates. Kremlin gave mild support for Tymoshenko and mild support for Yanukovych. And now we clearly see that Yanukovych has to be much more pro-Ukrainian, and he will have to integrate his electorate by making non-ideological appeals in a sphere of economics, in sphere of economic reform. That is the only one way for him to unite the country. So I doubt that Yanukovych is pro-Russian, likewise I doubt that Tymoshenko is pro-Western. This is true stereotype about Ukrainian politicians. Now we clearly see that they that they are oriented toward Ukrainian issues, and foreign policy is not the major issue in their political agenda.
Now, Katerina Furchuk, you mentioned earlier the constitutional issues that may emerge here. We have a situation where possibly the president will have a prime minister against who he ran in an election. Now, this particular point has arisen out of the circumstances around the Orange Revolution, that the president cannot unilaterally dismiss that prime minister, correct?
That's right. It's one of the ironies of Yanukovych's presidency now is the fact that the presidency he wanted so badly in 2004 was actually substantially weakened in order for Yushchenko to come to power. He was only sort of the repeat of the second round of the disputed presidential elections was only allowed to happen when elite, sort of the outgoing president and Yushchenko agreed a deal that the presidency would be much weaker. It came into force in 2006, and now the president does not control the prime minister directly. The prime minister is elected and accountable to the parliament. So that's a real challenge for Mr. Yanukovych to find basically a way of ousting Mrs. Tymoshenko from power and making sure that he has a prime minister he wants to work with. And this is really important because both of them, both Tymoshenko and Yanukovych, made extravagantly populist promises during the electoral campaign. They just about promised heaven on earth in Ukraine if they get elected. The problem is now for the new president, Mr. Yanukovych, that in order to deliver, he has to control the cabinet of ministers. But he doesn't do it at the moment. So the challenge is how to go about it. And I think here we may see actually to what extent he has developed his or consolidated his democratic credentials and to what extent he will actually respect the constitution and use constitutional means to consolidate his power more firmly.
Dmitry Babich, do you think it's possible that he could hold all these various factors together, that he could gain control of parliament?
The last 5 years have shown that in Ukraine just about everything is possible. Because there were moments when supporters of Mr. Yushchenko, who is supposed to be a diehard nationalist, when his supporters blocked with the supporters of Mr. Yanukovych against Tymoshenko. There were all sorts of very strange coalitions. So anything is possible, but I have a strong feeling that Mr. Yushchenko did not forgive Ms. Tymoshenko, so his supporters may block with Yanukovych in ousting her.
Sergei Taran, there in Kiev. Now, we've got a situation where there is going to be a great deal of political infighting. We've heard the task that would face the new president should he indeed win the election. Is he up to it? What kind of procedures are we going to see? We've had threats from the person coming second of taking the people to the streets. Is the democratic process going to hold?
Well, some observers believe that we are going to have the second Maidan, the second mass protest against the result of this presidential elections. But I doubt this because the situation is very different now. In 2005, in 2004, it was not about political elections. It was about choice of political system. At that time, people were about to choose not even politics, but it was about civilizational choice. But now it's just about two candidates in pure, transparent elections. So I doubt that people would go to the street and support one or another candidate. It is a big deal for Yanukovych now is to create a new coalition in the parliament, and that is true. This is a big problem for him because as for now he cannot control the government. So I do believe that he is going to create this new coalition in the parliament with our Ukraine, with former opponents, and they are going to have very ideological coalition. It's going to be a coalition which would suggest economic agenda, and it's going to be the coalition which are going to get support in many regions of Ukraine. So I believe that in some times we would see a different kind of Yanukovych. The future Yanukovych is not going to be radical. He is going to be very modest in what he was saying before the elections.
Katerina Wojcik, I mean, if I can ask you, what do you think the politicians might have learned from an election that has been very closely contested, and certainly a great degree of disillusion might have been shown in the result. Is there a lesson in it for the politicians attempting to be in power?
Ideally, yes. In practice, it is very difficult to see how the Ukrainian politicians can put aside their partisan political interest, immediate political interest, and think what's best for the country. And that's perhaps the greatest loss of the Orange Revolution. There were massive societal expectations, and the political class as a whole has not delivered. It remains sort of very much preoccupied with short-term thinking, sort of infighting, rather than thinking about systematic reforms, transforming the state, which this is something the whole of Ukraine wants. And this is something perhaps, given the current political situation and climate, perhaps it's going to be, even with Mr. Yanukovych in power as the president, is going to be difficult to deliver.
Dmitry Babich, is the political hierarchy capable of change, do you believe?
I'm not sure, because actually if we look at all the figures in this presidential campaign, they all started their careers under Mr. Kuchma, and they all have the support of powerful financial oligarchic clans behind them. Mr. Yushchenko was a finance minister and prime minister under Kuchma. Mr. Yanukovych was the prime minister. Tymoshenko ran Ukrainian energy. So they are not new people. None of them is a new person. And I wish Ukraine all kinds of success. I want this country to be successful and to get out of the economic crisis. What I can only say is that the Western vision of reform in Ukraine, very often it takes anti-Russian character. I don't know why. The idea in the West is that if Ukraine moves away from Russia, Ukraine will automatically become richer, more democratic, better governed, etc.
A last word from Sergei Taran in Kiev. Sergei, is this perhaps an opportunity for real change, an opportunity for a new beginning?
It is definitely an opportunity. In particular, it is an opportunity not because of votes of Yanukovych and Tymoshenko, but also because of votes given to other candidates like Tihipko and Yatsenyuk. In these elections, people supported new candidates, and we have very high support for new candidates, not because they are very nice people, but because they symbolize demands for changes. And we can clearly see that we have this demand in the Ukrainian society, and it should be the signal for other politicians like Tymoshenko and Yanukovych that they will have to do something. They will have to provide large-scale reforms, particularly economic reforms. Otherwise, a new wave of politicians will sweep them out.
Demands for change in Ukraine. Thank you to our guests, Sergei Taran in Kiev, Dmitry Babich in Moscow, and Katerina Furchuk in Birmingham. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'm Mike Hanna. Goodbye for now.